This session is sponsored by Microsoft. The title of our webinar is Modernize Your Data Assets with Azure SQL Cloud to Edge Databases. Okay, so before we start our webinar, allow me to quickly introduce InfoAlchemy. So InfoAlchemy is a data analytics and consulting and outsourcing company. We've been in the industry for the last 20 years. I am one of the co-founders of InfoAlchemy. So at InfoAlchemy, we help our customers by empowering them with data. For the last 20 years, we've been able to help hundreds of customers with their data analytics, data warehousing, and business intelligence implementations, including data science, AI, ML project. So what I like to highlight is in the last 3 years prior to the pandemic, we've been recognized by online magazines for our successful big data implementations in the Philippines. In terms of our core competencies, our capabilities span from the more traditional data warehousing, data quality, master data management, business intelligence, to the more advanced data lake implementation, big data analytics, including machine learning and data science. At InfoAlchemy, our mission is to empower our customers with data. And to be able to do this, we have been and follow a data analytics adoption framework. So typically, we start our conversations with our customers with self-service business intelligence. And then depending on their readiness and maturity, we expand to a data warehouse discussion, which leads to a 360-degree view of customer implementation. But our end goal is to bring our customers to the promised land of big data and analytics, where they can leverage and explore AI, ML use cases to accelerate their digital transformation. So for today, I would like to focus on the build and automate phase of our digital transformation acceleration road. So in the next 40 minutes, 50 minutes, we will be discussing how you can start building and automating your processes in the cloud, starting with your migration workload. Okay, again, we would like to thank Microsoft for sponsoring this webinar. So for today, we will be discussing how you can migrate your legacy data assets in order to modernize your data architectures in the cloud on the Microsoft Azure platform. Our agenda for today, we will have two parts. Part one is the following. We'll be covering what are the drivers that drive migration to the cloud and why you should consider migrating your databases to the cloud. We will also discuss some strategies that you can consider when you decide to migrate your databases to the cloud. I'll also introduce to you the Azure SQL database family. These are the options that you can consider in choosing which platform to migrate your on-premise databases into. And then I'll provide you with some tips on how you can migrate your databases to Azure. Okay, so let's start with part one. There are several issues that are driving organizations to migrate their databases to the cloud. Let's quickly go through each one of them. For infrastructure-related issues, organizations are moving to the cloud when their data center contracts expire. There are several issues that are driving organizations to move to the cloud. So let's quickly go through these issues. So these are some of the infrastructure-related drivers. When organizations have an expiring up-and-coming data center contract expiration, their option is either to renew their data center contract or they use the opportunity to move to the cloud. Another issue is when there's an upcoming end-of-life support for some of their databases, applications, and other software. So the decision is whether to upgrade and still continue with an on-premise implementation, or again, leverage the opportunity to upgrade and migrate to the cloud. Other issues that drive companies to migrate to the cloud also include integrations with new business units or new acquired businesses, as well as when they are expecting a huge ramp up in capacity. So to mitigate the risk, they decide to once and for all move to the cloud, or at least extend a portion of their application, particularly online interfaces, and move them to the cloud. And lastly, every 3 to 5 year cycle, companies do a hardware and software refresh. So it's a good opportunity for them to move to the cloud. Other issues and drivers that you need to decide on when moving to the cloud are application oriented. So meaning if you want to upgrade your security, or if you need to comply with a regulatory compliance, you need to decide whether you want to leverage the new security platforms, new architecture that are compliant with the regulatory standards. And these are often only available in the cloud. And lastly, I think this is the most important driver for moving to the cloud. When you want to innovate and leverage the modern architectures in the cloud to upgrade your applications, this is a good time to consider moving to the cloud. Let me ask you a question in the chat window. Can you type which driver or which of these issues are driving you to consider moving to the cloud? You can just quickly type in the chat window whether you are expecting a data center contract expiration, software end of support, or application innovation, security, and so on. We only have one answer, infra from Jimbo. How about the others? What's your main motivation for moving to the cloud? Hope you can share with us. Please feel free to type your answers in the chat window. Okay, moving on. So here are some of the considerations that you need to take a look at when moving your databases to the cloud. One of the key motivations for moving to the cloud is to optimize on the infrastructure cost. The cloud provides you with the lowest total cost of ownership for maintaining your databases and keep them operational. Another key reason is to automate and leverage new security capabilities that are available in the cloud. For example, when you choose to migrate to Azure SQL, there are built-in capabilities that allow you to address advanced threat protection and other security requirements. And as I mentioned earlier, the main motivation for moving to the cloud is to allow you to innovate faster or transform faster. There are a lot of capabilities that are only available in the cloud that you can leverage to innovate faster within your organization. When you decide to migrate your databases to the cloud, there are several options or strategies that you need to consider. So let's discuss each one of them. The first migration strategy is what we call rehost, or typically this is also referred to as the lift and shift strategy. With the lift and shift strategy, your application is migrated to the cloud as is. You're not changing versions, you're not changing platforms, database platforms to support your application. Whatever application and database that you are using on premise, with this migration strategy, we completely migrate your application stack into the cloud. To do this, you can leverage the Azure virtual machines to migrate your application stack. And if your application is running on top of SQL Server on premise, you can use SQL Server on Azure virtual machine to rehost your application. So that is the most common cloud migration strategy that is called lift and shift. The next strategy that you can consider is called refactor, or also referred to as repackage. So you can repackage your application to take advantage of the available infrastructure in the cloud. So you can either migrate to an infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, or to a platform as a service, or PaaS environment. So I'll share with you what are your options later to be able to do this. Next strategy that you may want to consider is the re-architect migration strategy. So in this strategy, you decide not only to migrate your application, but also to re-architect or modernize your application to be able to leverage the latest modern applications or modern architecture in the cloud. So to be able to do this, you can either use or leverage the Azure SQL database, which is a PaaS, platform as a service offering from Microsoft. And lastly, the migration strategy that you can also consider is to rebuild. So meaning you will completely redevelop, redesign your application so that you can leverage the modern architecture in the cloud. So I would say this should be your last resort, as this would take a longer time for you to redevelop and redesign. But if you don't have any other choice, if you cannot buy ready-made cloud-based applications out there, then your only option or last option is to rebuild. Okay, so let's do a quick Paul, again, can you share with us which migration strategy are you considering at the moment? Is it rehosting, refactoring, re-architecting, or rebuilding? Can you quickly type in the chat window, please? How many of you are planning to do a lift and shift or rehosting migration? Or if you're not yet ready to migrate, just let us know what you are considering, what strategy you are considering. Okay, so why choose to migrate to Azure for your cloud databases? So here are summary of why our customers who are using SQL Server on-premise are migrating to Azure. Number one, of course, SQL Server has been in the industry for the last 25 years, right? And over the 25 years, Microsoft has been innovating on SQL Server, and that applies as well to Azure, to SQL Server in Azure. Azure also provides seamless migration for your SQL Server workloads, with starting with the lift and shift or the other migration strategies. There are tools available which I will share with you, so you can seamlessly migrate your SQL workloads to Azure. When you move to Azure, you can leverage some of the Azure exclusive offers that allow you to save up to 87% or up to 80% cost reduction and performance improvements. And then lastly, there are available tools that you can use to automate the migration of your workloads to the cloud, and these are available at no cost to you. So let me now introduce to you the Azure SQL Database family. So when you consider migrating your SQL Server workloads from on-premise to the cloud, these are your SQL Server options, right? So if you want to do a lift and shift, meaning your application on-premise runs on top of SQL Server, the easiest way for you to migrate is via lift and shift strategy. So you can use SQL Server on Azure virtual machines as to rehost your application. With this type of infrastructure as a service, you have full access to the OS, so you can do whatever configuration that is needed for your application to run in the cloud. The next two options for you is Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. These are platform as a service database, SQL Server databases. So if you need access at the instance level, you use Azure SQL Managed Instance. If you don't have to do any configurations at the instance level or at the OS level, you just simply want to store data in SQL, then you can choose Azure SQL Database. And lastly, this is a new addition to the SQL Server or Azure SQL Database family. We have Azure SQL Edge. So if you have Internet of Things or IoT applications that you need to stream data from and into an Edge database, so you can leverage Azure SQL Edge to support your workload. Again, let me ask you, please type in the chat window which of these Azure SQL databases you are considering and you'd like to know more about. Okay, please type in SQL Server Azure virtual machines or Azure SQL Managed Instance or Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Edge. Thanks. So let's go through what are the decision points when migrating and choosing which Azure SQL database is right for you. Okay, so if you just need to migrate your database and you need access to OS level, then your option is SQL Server Azure VM. If your current SQL Server version is 2008 to 2019, to maintain your and reuse your licenses on premise, then you can apply that towards your SQL Server Azure virtual machine. If you are using other capabilities at the virtual machine level, that is only available to you if you move or if you migrate to SQL Server on Azure VM. And lastly, if you are using SQL Server for services and SQL Server analysis services for your business intelligence capabilities and other reporting capabilities, and you need to access these services, then your only option is to migrate to SQL Server on Azure VM. If you're looking to modernize your application and you need database instance, meaning you need to configure at the instance level, or if you have a linked database server that you need to integrate with, or if you need to do and accommodate transactions across other database platforms, platforms, then your option is to migrate to Azure SQL Managed Instance. So any capability that you need at the instance level, whether it's SQL agent services or the other services available to you, like such as SSIS or SQL Server Integration Services, then you can do all this via Azure SQL Managed Instance. And lastly, if you are looking to innovate, meaning you're looking to rebuild, re-architect your applications, and all you need is a database to host your data or to store data and process them at the database level, your option is to use Azure SQL Database, which is a platform as a service offering. May I ask which database flavor are you considering given this decision chart? Are you looking at SQL Server Virtual Machine on Azure's Virtual Machine or SQL Server Managed Instance or Azure SQL Databases? Okay, so moving on, if you have a database on-premise that you're looking to migrate and you're using those databases for business intelligence, for data warehousing, you can consider these options. If you want to, for example, still use SQL Server Integration Services for your ETL, data integration and transformation, the equivalent of SSIS in the cloud is the Azure Data Factory. All right. So if you have existing SSIS packages on premise, you can run and execute them in Azure via Azure Data Factory. Or if you have existing reporting services, paginated reports, um, you can still use them by deploying them in Power BI. And if you need to maintain your SQL Server analysis services or your OLAP cubes, your tabular data models to support your BI reports, the equivalent of SSAS in Azure is Azure Analysis Services or AAS. And then lastly, if you need to if you have a multidimensional OLAP, um, which are the traditional cubes that you uh, need to maintain, the only option for you to deploy that in the cloud is via SQL Server Analysis Services, um, which can run on a virtual machine in Azure. Okay, again, if you want to know more how you can do this, please type in the chat window whether you need help on SSIS, SSRS, and SSAS migration. Okay, so moving on. Regardless of your workloads in SQL Server on-premise, the Azure SQL is still the best option for you. Um, uh, especially if you want to innovate and accelerate your digital transformation, Azure SQL is a fully managed and is always up to date in terms of the capabilities that are made available in SQL Server. Um, and you can leverage your existing capabilities and experience uh, when you move to the cloud. If you maintain your databases, if you need to maintain your same programming, same code base for your applications, then you certainly need to consider Azure SQL. And in terms of um, cost considerations, you can save a lot when you move your SQL Server workload on-premise to Azure. And lastly, in terms of security, um, there are more available services around security, around data privacy, around data protection in the cloud that are available to you when you move to Azure. So for example, Azure SQL has several offers that you can use or leverage to help you lower your total cost of ownership. So number one, you have the Azure Hybrid benefit. So this benefit allows you to leverage your existing um, on-premise licenses. So when you move to Azure, you can save up to 59% uh, of the cost compared to moving your SQL Server to other cloud platforms. Once in the cloud, you can also leverage the reserve capacity, which will allow you to save um, up to 33% more. Um, and you can combine it with your hybrid benefit, which would lead up to about 80% in savings. And also, when you move to Azure SQL, you can save up on your costs, on the cost for having a separate dev and test environment. All you need to do is subscribe to Visual Studio to be able to avail of the further discounts on your dev and test environment. And lastly, if you are migrating due to the upcoming SQL Server 2008 end of life, you can get an extended update. So meaning you don't need to upgrade to a new version. You can get up to 3 years if you migrate your SQL Server 2008 to the Azure virtual machine. Again, please type in the chat window if you need more information on how you can leverage these offers to lower your overall TCO. How much you can save with an Azure hybrid benefit. So let me skip this. You can just go through it. We will give you a copy of the slides. Um, there's also a study done by the Enterprise Strategy Group that validates the savings. So when you decide to migrate to Azure, you can first decide on migrating via the SQL Server on virtual machines or via IaaS. And then later on, you can move to a PaaS environment to gain additional savings. Okay, in terms of security, we have uh, several layers that help you to address threat protection, access management, and data protection. So under the advanced threat protection services that are built into Azure SQL, you have information protection, vulnerability scanning, threat detection, as well as centralized dashboards. For access management, you have network access, database access, and granular permissions. So under access management, you have more granular way of controlling how your databases are accessed by the network at the database level, even at the user level with SQL roles and permissions. And lastly, at the data protection, you can protect your data at rest or while in use or in transit via the built-in data encryption services. You can also protect your data at the row level and via dynamic data masking within your applications, as well as for monitoring to help you with your audit controls. And lastly, Azure SQL has is the most compliant in terms of standard regulatory uh, uh, compliance requirements more than any other cloud databases. So what about migrating non-SQL Server workloads on-premise to the cloud, right? So um, if you are using MySQL, PostgreSQL, or MariaDB on-premise, you have the option to migrate these databases uh, in Azure via the Azure Open Source Database Services. So there are specific MySQL, Postgre, and MariaDB database services in Azure that you can migrate to. These options provide you with the best total cost of ownership, given that these are open source. So if you are comfortable in running your open source databases in the cloud, you can leverage the Azure Open Source Database Services. Okay, to wrap up part one. So this summarizes what you need to consider when migrating your databases to Azure. So on column one, these are your on-premises responsibilities, right? Meaning on-premise, you need to manage your applications, your data, your disaster recovery, high availability, backups, and so on, including database provisioning, patching, and so on. So any configurations at the OS level, whether you want to do virtualization or hardware upgrades, or if you need to manage the entire data center. On premises, these you are responsible to manage all of these. When you move to an IaaS environment in Azure, um, Microsoft assumes the responsibility in managing the virtualization of your database, the hardware, as well as data center management. Okay, so you can leave you can leave that to Microsoft to manage, whether you're using SQL Server, MySQL, Postgre, or MariaDB on Azure VMs. So Microsoft will take care of that for you. Um, if you are moving or migrating to a PaaS environment, then Microsoft provides you or with the service to manage your high availability, your disaster recovery, backups, as well as provisioning and patching of your databases, including your OS, virtualization, hardware, and data center management. So all you are left to do is to manage your application and your data. Okay, so let me pause here. Please type in the chat window if you have any questions. No questions so far? Okay, moving on to part two. So for part two, we will cover the entire database migration process. So I'll share with you what are the various steps in migrating your databases to the cloud. I'll also share with you some of the migration tools that you can use to migrate your databases to Azure. I'll also share and discuss some of the scenarios that you can consider. And I'll introduce to you the Azure TCO calculator so that you can decide properly even before you migrate to the cloud. And lastly, I'll share with you how you can further optimize your costs during and after migrating to Azure. Okay, so let's continue. So I have a diagram here that covers the end-to-end database migration process. So these are there are three parts to this process. So first, let's discuss the pre-migration process. So before you even do your decision to migrate, you can do um, some assessments um, and to also estimate how much you'll be saving when you move to the cloud. So to do this, you need to discover um, what assets you have available on premise that you can consider migrating to the cloud. And then you need to assess what are the workloads, whether they need to be fixed first before you move them to the cloud. And for heterogeneous migrations, meaning you're considering to migrate to another database platform, you need to find ways to convert your source schema to the target environment. Okay, so there are available tools which I will share in my succeeding slide. These tools you can use to do your assessments, to discover what available um, database workloads that you can migrate, and whether you will be needing to convert those schema to the target environment. Okay, so that's the pre-migration process. Discover, assess, and convert. During the actual migration, um, you do this is where you migrate the schema first, uh, followed by the data and other database objects from your source environment to the target. So it's very important uh, that you know and decide which platform you want to migrate to. So if you are using SQL Server on premise, your first option would be to, or best option would be to migrate them in Azure SQL. Any of the Azure SQL database family you can consider. Um, if you're using open source databases on premise, then you have two options. Either you migrate to the same open source platform or you migrate to Azure SQL, right? Whatever your decision is, uh, there are tools available for you to help you easily migrate to either SQL Server or to the other open source databases in Azure. Once you have migrated your schema, your data, and your database objects, um, you need to do a data sync. This is to synchronize your cloud database with your on-premise databases, especially uh, if you have a cutover that you need to do on a weekend, for example, it might take a couple of days. So once you're done with the cutover, then you need to sync that with your on-premise databases. Okay, in terms of post-migration, once you've done your cutover, you need to do some performance testing and evaluate whether you need to do some tuning at the database level, or if you are migrating to SQL Server on virtual machine, you can also tune at the OS level. Or you can choose to upgrade your memory, for example, or your database cores. Um, so that's the optimize and remediate steps. Um, and so periodically, you need to monitor whether your migrated database is performing based on your expectations, or if it's meeting your expectations or not. And then you repeat this cycle, you optimize and remediate, um, and then you keep on monitoring. So this is the database migration process. If you have any questions in the pre-migration or during the actual migration and post-migration, please type your questions in the chat window and I'll get back to them later. Okay, so what are the tools that you can use when you migrate to Azure, right? So there are two types of tools. You have assessment tools and you have migration tools. So to help you with your assessment, when you discover your various data asset inventory, and estimate the cost, right, of migrating, of operating your database workloads in the cloud. There are available tools such as Azure Migrate, SQL Server Migration Assistant, Data Migration Assistant, and so on. I'll go through each one of these in my succeeding slides. For your actual migration, you can automate the migration process by using Azure Database Migration Service. You can also use Azure Data Studio. There's an Azure SQL Migration Extension module that you need to install if you want to use your Azure Data Studio during the migration process. Okay, so Azure Migrate is a migration service that you can use to assess and migrate your SQL Server. All you need to do is point Azure Migrate to your network, on-premise network, and it will allow you to discover what SQL Server services are available, and you can get a report and even a recommendation on what Azure SQL database or platform is suitable for your current environment. Okay. With Azure Migrate, you can also um, cover various scenarios. It can handle migrations from Windows to Linux or vice versa. Uh, Whether you're migrating OS at the OS level or database level, or if you're just moving data, including your web applications and virtual desktops. Okay, so with Azure Migrate, you can discover your assets, you can assess, and you can get a recommendation on which database platform to migrate to. So yeah, I encourage you to uh, check Azure Migrate. Just log into your Azure account, and then under the services, just search for Azure Migrate to learn more about this tool. Okay, if you are running on a VMware environment, you can also use the Azure Migrate Readiness Assessment to discover all your SQL Server instances and databases running on your VMware environment. And from Azure Migrate, you can check their configurations, even take a snapshot of their performance, and to be able to map your database to the correct configuration in Azure. Um, and also you can do some cost projections before you decide to migrate. If you are familiar with Azure Data Studio, um, you can install the SQL Server migration extension um, to allow you to perform database assessments and determine whether you're ready to migrate to Azure SQL or what your options would be if your current database workloads are not ready yet for migration. And then once you fix your current workloads, you can run the actual migration using Azure Data Studio. So this service is powered by Database Migration Service, which is another service in Azure that you can use to do the actual migration. So let me skip this slide and move to the Azure Database Migration Service. So the Azure Database Migration Service um, covers the migration of your database workloads, whether they are on-premise or if you have database workloads on other cloud platforms. Azure Database Migration Service can help you with the migration. Um, it provides you with a step-by-step guide on what you need to do to migrate your workloads. Um, you can also fully automate your migration, database migration with this service, especially if you have multiple databases on-premise and on other clouds. For large enterprises that have multiple databases. Okay, so as I was saying, for large enterprises that have multiple database instances on-premise and in other cloud platforms, this is the best way of this is the best tool that you can use to migrate your databases. You can do a full automation of your migration with this service. So let me now share with you some of the key scenarios and the tools that you will be needing to perform your migration. So if you want to check whether you are ready to migrate your data assets to the cloud, and if you're doing it for the first time, um, then you would need tools that can help you do the assessment and the actual migration with little assistance, right? So to do that, you can use Azure Migrate to discover your data assets on premise, whether they are on VMware or on physical hardware or virtual machines on premise. You can use Azure Migrate to do the assessment and discovery. Um, so with Azure Migrate, you can uh, you can get a full report on each database instance and a recommendation on which Azure SQL database you can consider. And then when you're ready, you can use Azure SQL Migration, the extension in Data Studio to do the actual migration, especially if you are migrating to Azure SQL VM or your Azure SQL Managed instance. Okay, the next scenario, if you have or once you have performed the discovery and assessment and you are now ready to migrate, and if you are migrating a single workload, meaning one database instance, you can use Azure SQL Migration Extension in Azure Data Studio or the migration assistant to migrate and deploy your schemas and use data migration service to do the actual database migration. For a full automation migration scenario, meaning you have several databases either on-premise or in various cloud platforms that you want to automate the migration process, let's say during off-peak hours, then you can do that using the database migration service. So to do that, to automate the migration process, you need to use the command line and the PowerShell commandlets and run them on schedule. Okay. If you have any questions on these migration scenarios, please type your questions in the chat window.
Hello, Sir Emil. I think there's a question in the chat box from Miss Chris.
Oh, hi. Okay, let me check.
Okay,
Hi,
thank you, sir.
Chris. So Chris is asking, how do you take advantage of Azure DB if the apps are not cloud ready? Okay. So in our earlier slide, um, this type of migration falls under the um, either the re-architect migration strategy or the rebuild migration strategy, right? So if your applications are not cloud ready, then you may need to re-architect them first, meaning uh, you need to look at um, the Azure database features that you want to leverage, and then modify your application so that you can um, use those features and functions that are only available in Azure databases. That's the only way. You also have the option of um, it's there's also an option on either building or buying a new application, right? So, but if your only option is to migrate your existing application, um, you can consider lifting and shifting your application to the cloud using Azure SQL on virtual machine. Um, Let it stabilize there, and then that will buy you some time to re-architect your application um, and develop new functionality based on the Azure SQL features and functions that you need to or you want to leverage. Did I answer your question, Chris?
Yes, thank you, Emil. But I have a follow-up question in a bit. I'm typing.
Okay, sure. So let me finish my slides and then we can go to the Q&A. Okay, so when you use the database migration assistant, you can get recommendations on what type of Azure SQL database that you can use to maintain the same performance, uh, and I think it will advise you with some of the configurations as well. So you can definitely check this out, check this feature in the database migration assistant. And if you want to know how much it would cost you to run your databases in the cloud, you can use the Azure TCO calculator. It will show you the cost to run your database today. You can also see a projection of how much it will cost in the future if you don't migrate it to the cloud, and how much it will cost and the savings that you will get when you uh, migrate to the cloud. So this is a good tool to help you with your business case before you decide to move to Azure. Okay, I believe this is my last slide. So how you can optimize your costs during and after migration. So first, during or even before you migrate, right? You can use the Azure TCO calculator to come up with your cost model and compare your on-premises cost versus your Azure cost when you decide to move to or to migrate to Azure SQL. And then you can use us to help you build your business case and get approval for the migration. And then you can use Azure Migrate uh, to right size the resources that you'll be needing. And then you can leverage the Azure Hybrid benefit to avail of the up to 50% discount, right? You can reuse your existing Azure licenses or at least get additional discounts, right, when you move to uh, Azure SQL. And then finally, you can use the Azure migration tools, and you can join the modernization program to watch out for some and get tips on how you can go through the migration process easily and smoothly. After you've done your migration, once you're in Azure, you can use the Azure Advisor, and it can recommend when you need to shut down during idle times, right? It will recommend how you can further optimize your costs using features like and other features in Azure, including Azure policies and Azure cost management. So this is my last slide. I've included some references in the deck, so you can follow this link. If you need further help, just indicate um, in the feedback form. We also offer a free proof of concept if you want to explore Azure SQL databases. Just schedule, we can schedule a deep dive discovery session with you. Just indicate your uh, availability in the feedback form and we will contact you to arrange the meeting. Okay, so thank you. Let me switch to the Q&A session.